Welcome to the debate. When a ship sets out into completely uncharted waters, the crew relies heavily on the stars.
Right, for navigation.
Exactly. The stars provide this eternal, fixed, pristine guidance. But eventually, to navigate the day-to-day practical realities of a complex ocean, the shoals, the currents, the weather, sailors start drawing maps based on those stars.
Making it practical for the crew.
Yes. And over time, generation after generation, the maps become so incredibly detailed, so layered and complex, that the crew stops looking up at the sky entirely. They just look at the parchment.
And that is exactly the phenomenon we are dissecting today. The parchment becomes the reality. The map replaces the territory.
Precisely. Today, we are exploring this exact historical and epistemological shift within Islamic civilization. We're drawing from Leslie Terebesi's profound analysis in Rethinking Islam, Reintegration of Revelation and Tradition.
It's a fascinating text.
It really is. We are examining the massive transition from a revelation-centric paradigm, one guided directly by the Quran, to a tradition-centric paradigm, which is guided heavily by the Hadith and the Sunnah, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet.
And the core tension within this material, the real heart of the issue, is whether this shift was a tragic, civilization-breaking mistake or an absolutely unavoidable evolution.
Exactly. The central question before us is this. Did the institutionalization and elevation of tradition fundamentally eclipse revelation and trigger the intellectual and political decline of the Muslim world, or was the development of tradition and a structurally inevitable framework for interpreting revelation that was only later politically exploited?
It's a heavy question.
It is. I represent the position that elevating human tradition to the level of divine revelation was a fatal deviation that repressed human reason, weaponized the faith, and directly caused civilizational decay.
And I argue that the codification of tradition was an unavoidable hermeneutical necessity to operationalize a transcendent text for daily life, even if authoritarian rulers ultimately co-opted that framework for their own gain.
Let me begin by laying out my perspective in a bit more detail. When you dive into the historical record, a compelling, evidence-based case emerges that the integration of tradition did not merely supplement the Quran, it actively superseded it.
Superseded is a strong word.
But an accurate one, I think. This was an epistemological usurpation. The most glaring evidence of this is the doctrine of naskh, or abrogation.
Right.
This was a legal mechanism that allowed jurists to claim that later human traditions could literally overrule or, delete authentic verses of the divine book. And this epistemic shift wasn't just some abstract ivory tower theory. It resulted in tangible, lethal corruptions of penal law.
Like what, specifically?
Well, for example, instituting the death penalty for apostasy and adultery. As Terebesi explicitly points out, neither of these terrestrial death penalties are prescribed anywhere in the Quran. But to achieve this massive substitution, replacing the divine word with human hearsay, the jurists required the systemic repression of human reason.
You're talking about the gates of ijtihad.
Exactly. They had to close the gates of ijtihad, the practice of independent human reasoning, to ensure no one could challenge their authority.
I come at it from a different way because I think we have to look at the massive epistemological vacuum that early scholars actually faced on the ground.
Fair enough.
Revelation provides profound, transcendent, universal principles. But early jurists were forced to deal with the immediate, highly practical realities of administering a vast, rapidly expanding, and incredibly complex society.
Sure. The empire was growing fast.
Unbelievably fast. If you look at the primary sources, early scholars perceived ambiguities and a lack of specific detail in the text regarding day-to-day administration. They genuinely needed tradition to explain and complete it.
But complete it with what? Human opinions?
With a systematic methodology. The creation of usul al-fiqh, which is the fundamental principles of deriving laws, and ijma, or scholarly consensus. These were highly rational attempts to standardize law and prevent complete interpretive chaos across an empire.
So you don't see the creation of tradition as a tragedy?
No, I don't. The tragedy here was not the creation of tradition as an interpretive lens. The tragedy was its later weaponization by Umayyad and Abbasid rulers to justify despotic expansionism. I mean, the early scholars were trying to build a bridge. The despots turned it into a weapon.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You describe this as building a bridge or, a rational attempt to prevent administrative chaos. But let's look closely at the mechanics of how this tradition was elevated.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics.
I liken this to building scaffolding to construct a magnificent building. The scaffolding is useful, certainly. You needed to reach the higher floors.
Right.
But what happened here is that the architects eventually declared that the scaffolding is equal to the building. And eventually, they moved out of the building entirely to live in the scaffolding.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?
I don't think it is. The historical record shows that traditionalists explicitly claimed, and I quote, "The Sunnah stands in judgment over the Quran."
Yes, al-Awza'i.
Exactly. The 8th century scholar al-Awza'i. He went so far as to assert that the Quran needs the Sunnah more than the Sunnah needs the Quran. That is not just filling an administrative vacuum. That is effectively reversing the divine hierarchy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that framing. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
Scholars like al-Awza'i didn't set out to destroy or undermine Islam. They were operating in a context where they had to resolve practical legal challenges every single day. When they said the Sunnah stands in judgment over the Quran, they were speaking hermeneutically.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning they desperately needed a standardized lens to interpret the text for daily life. They were determining that the Sunnah specifies what the Quran states only in broad general terms. Take something as fundamental as prayer.
Okay.
If the Quran says to pray, the Sunnah explains the physical mechanics of how to pray, the postures, the timings. The early Muslim community didn't have a formalized written legal code. They were building one from scratch.
But it shifted from a partnership to a usurpation.
Yes, treating tradition as a partner to revelation created a paradigm shift, and Tarabesi explicitly notes that over time, the lines blurred and tradition became an equal or even a judge. But you have to view this as an organic, cumulative process of a civilization trying to operationalize its founding document. You cannot run an empire stretching from Spain to India purely on transcendent universals. You need specific codes.
But hold on. When those specific codes start actively defying the transcendent universals, you cross a major line. And that's exactly what happened.
Defying in what way?
Well, it is absolutely vital to remember that the recording of these traditions was originally prohibited. The Prophet himself reportedly forbade the recording of the Sunnah lest it be confused with the Quran.
That is true. The early prohibitions were strict.
Right. It wasn't until caliphs like Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz authorized it much later that this process of amalgamation truly began. And once it was written down and amalgamated, it didn't just specify the Quran, it began to override it. Which brings us to the actual mechanics of what this shift accomplished politically, specifically through the tool of nask, or abrogation.
Abrogation is certainly the most contentious hermeneutical tool they developed.
Contentious is an understatement. It was destructive. Let's really unpack the mechanics of abrogation, because it's a brilliant but dark piece of intellectual gymnastics.
How so?
Well, how do you convince a deeply faithful population that the divine word is perfect, yet simultaneously claim that hundreds of verses are legally void?
They used diachronic logic.
Exactly, meaning they looked at the timeline of revelation. If a chronologically later verse or tradition seemed to conflict with an earlier one, they essentially created a delete button, claiming the later text canceled out the earlier one's legal weight.
It was meant to resolve contradictions.
But look at how it was used. Using this exact mechanism, over 200 verses, specifically the peace verses, the verses advocating reconciliation, tolerance, and patience, were declared abrogated by a single later verse, the verse of the sword, or ayasaf.
And that had massive geopolitical ramifications.
Massive. A concept that was allegedly meant to transcribe or clarify was warped into a logic where later human traditions overruled authoritative divine verses. This single intellectual maneuver transformed Islam's core teaching of reconciliation into a political doctrine of jihad at-talab, wars of aggression.
It shifted the whole paradigm of foreign policy.
It completely altered international relations, dividing the world into a binary, the abode of Islam and the abode of war. It gave direct religious cover to imperial looting. This wasn't theoretical. It led directly to disastrous, hubristic military campaigns.
You're thinking of the Ottoman campaigns?
Yes, think of the sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683. Tarabesi notes that in 1529, Sultan Suleiman launched an army of 100,000 men into the mud and freezing rain of Europe, resulting in a disastrous retreat. And all of it was justified by this hawkish, traditionalist corruption of the faith.
That is a compelling, horrifying historical reality, I agree. But have you considered that abrogation was originally conceived purely as a tool to reconcile perceived textual contradictions, not as a grand military strategy?
It still provided the ammunition.
But you would blaming the tool for the actions of the wielder. The political doctrine of jihad al-talab was a gross misapplication by the fuqaha, the elite class of legal scholars who had the ear of the rulers and who were corrupted by their alliances with those despots.
So the framework is innocent?
I'm saying the tool of tradition itself is capable of profound self-correction. If you look at the subsequent centuries, many later scholars recognized the intense danger of massive abrogation. Brilliant minds like Abu Jafar al-Nahas, Ibn al-Jawzi, and al-Suyuti fought back fiercely against this radical excision of verses.
They did push back, yes.
They successfully reduced the number of abrogated verses from over 200 down to 20. Later, the great 18th century scholar Shah Waliullah al-Dilawi successfully shrank the number of abrogated verses down to just 5.
Just 5.
Right. This proves that the traditional framework has internal mechanisms for debate and correction. The true culprit was the alliance between hawkish ulama and despotic rulers seeking imperial expansion, utilizing the language of religion to mask their geopolitical ambitions.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are separating the tool from the environment it inevitably creates.
How do you mean?
You ask if I've considered that the rulers were the true culprits. Yes, the rulers were despots, but the rulers could only execute these massive geopolitical ambitions because the traditionalist framework systemically repressed the very faculty required for the public to resist them. Human reason. These despots, because their intellectual capacity had been paralyzed by their own theology.
Paralysis is a strong word for a civilization that produced some of the greatest scientific advancements of the medieval world.
It is a strong word, but an incredibly accurate one when you look at the timeline of the decline. Let's look at how systemic this repression of reason actually was. In the year 786, Caliph Musa al-Hadi orchestrated the violent purge of 5,000 philosophers.
Yeah, the purge under Musa al-Hadi was an undeniable atrocity. It was an incredibly dark chapter where political insecurity met religious fanaticism.
Exactly. This was a slaughter explicitly aimed at pulling empirical science and independent thought up by its roots. And the violence wasn't just physical, it became deeply ideological and institutionalized.
You mean in the curricula?
Yes. Consider the Ibn Rajab manifesto from the 14th century. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a blueprint for intellectual stagnation.
It severely limited what could be studied.
It explicitly discouraged learning arithmetic beyond what was absolutely necessary to divide an estate. It banned geography beyond finding the direction of Mecca for prayer. It prohibited astronomy beyond tracking the lunar month for fasting. Even studying Arabic grammar too deeply was discouraged.
It was a very utilitarian, narrow view of knowledge.
Narrow is putting it mildly. This anti-rationalism was then cemented theologically through two catastrophic concepts, the doctrine of absolute predestination and taqlid, which is blind, unquestioning imitation of past scholars.
And those two concepts, predestination and taqlid, effectively ended the era of dynamic theological debate.
Precisely. By teaching that every single event was preordained by God and that independent thought, fikr, was akin to disbelief, the ulama, the religious scholars, stripped the populace of free will and accountability.
That's a profound psychological shift.
Tarabesi bluntly states this turned the Muslim populace into a flock succumbing to the will of the political ruler. Think about the cognitive shift here. If your theology says the ruler's oppressive actions are actually God's preordained will, then resisting a tyrant isn't just treason.
It's heresy.
Exactly, it's heresy against God.
I don't disagree that the suppression of reason had catastrophic long-term effects. The modern scholar Fazlur Rahman accurately described the prohibition of ijtihad as intellectual suicide.
Intellectual suicide, yes.
The stagnation is an undeniable historical fact, but we have to analyze why the Ummah, the global Muslim community, turned to taqlid and these rigid orthodox schools in the first place. Was it just a malicious plot, or was it a trauma response?
A trauma response to what?
To geopolitical existential threats. Could a purely rationalist, highly decentralized approach, where every individual practices their own ijtihad, have survived the immense pressures of the era? We're talking about the period surrounding the Crusaders from the west and the devastating Mongol hordes from the east.
The Mongol invasions were definitely a turning point.
A devastating one. The historical record shows that the Mongol invasion, triggered disastrously by the Shah of Khwarezm, let loose a whirlwind of absolute savagery upon the Islamic world, culminating in the sack of Baghdad in 1258. The rivers famously ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of scholars.
It was an apocalyptic event for the civilization.
Right. And in times of existential threat and catastrophic instability, human societies do not usually embrace decentralized philosophical inquiry. They circle the wagons. They seek the comfort of absolute, unbending certainty.
So you see taqlid as a defensive posture.
Yes. The rigid orthodox schools provided a necessary stabilizing identity. It was a survival mechanism that unfortunately ossified into a permanent state of being.
I see why you think that. And the trauma of the Mongol invasions is profoundly important context. But let me give you a different perspective on that survival mechanism.
Okay, let's hear it.
A survival mechanism that requires you to stop thinking eventually kills you anyway. By closing the door to ijtihad, they didn't protect the house, they locked themselves inside while it burned down.
That's a grim metaphor.
Because they lacked the intellectual capacity to cope with the demands of a rapidly changing world. They regressed. They took refuge in exploded myths and rigid dogma. And the ultimate consequence of this was the institutionalization of fatalism.
Fatalism? In what sense?
Let me give you an analogy. Think about how a society handles a crisis, like a plague or a severe famine. A society driven by reason and causal logic asks, how is this spreading? What is the biological or agricultural cause, and how do we solve it?
Seeking empirical solutions?
Exactly. But a society driven by strict fatalism and predestination says, this is God's pre-written will, so investigating it or trying to stop it is practically a rebellion against the divine. That is the intellectual paralysis we are talking about.
I see.
This intellectual decrepitude is exactly why, from the 18th century onward, the Muslim world found itself utterly impotent when confronted by Western imperialism. They had actively abandoned the inductive inquiries and empirical sciences that they themselves had once pioneered.
And that exact realization is the bitter pill that the 19th and 20th century reformists, figures like Muhammad Abdu and Jamaluddin al-Afghani, had to swallow.
Yes, the reformists saw the stark reality.
They looked at the state of the Ummah and recognized the terrible catastrophe of frittering away massive amounts of intellectual energy on trans-empirical controversies, debating the exact nature of the afterlife or the unseen, while the rest of the world developed superior technology, medicine, and military strategy.
It was a painful awakening.
Truly. But even those brilliant reformists understood a fundamental truth. You cannot simply delete centuries of historical evolution. You can't just jump from the 7th century texts to the 20th century realities and pretend the 1,300 years of intervening tradition simply doesn't exist. It is woven into the very fabric of the culture.
But Tarabessi's analysis strongly argues that this intervening tradition is precisely what is standing in the way of the original, liberating message of the Quran today.
Standing in the way entirely?
Yes, because this isn't just a historical debate about the 14th century. It is an active, ongoing crisis. Let's look at how deeply this anti-rationalism has penetrated modern educational institutions.
You're referring to the seminaries.
I am. There is a scathing critique of religious universities today, specifically pointing to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, one of the oldest and most prestigious seats of Islamic learning. The curriculum remains fundamentally trapped in this tradition-centric paradigm,
relying on rote memorization.
Emphasizing rote learning, parrot-fashion repetitions over any kind of critical thinking. We have documented accounts of students being taught that their brain is like a donkey, that only gets them to the palace door of God, and once they reach the door, they must leave their intellect outside.
That is a deeply troubling pedagogical approach.
And it gets darker. Al-Azhar's curriculum still contains rulings derived entirely from human tradition that mandate killing those who do not pray or killing apostates. This directly, blatantly contradicts the Quran's explicit statement that there is absolutely no compulsion in religion.
It is absolutely true that the focus on the physical form of religion over its spiritual substance, this intense binary lens of halal versus haram, the obsession with external rituals, has left many institutions in a state of sterile repetition.
Sterile, often dangerous.
You brought up Al-Azhar, and it's worth noting how a modern lawyer, Ahmed Abdo-Maher, bravely challenged Al-Azhar's endorsement of violent views found in traditional commentaries.
He faced significant backlash for that.
He did. The fact that the tradition-centric paradigm has been weaponized today to denounce liberal thinkers as infidels, or to object to civil education curriculums that promote religious tolerance, is a profound and urgent problem.
So you agree that tradition is the problem?
I agree it's currently a problem. However, the very fact that reformers like Ahmed Abdo-Maher exist shows that the Muslim world is actively grappling with this from within. The pushback exists. The historical tragedy is that the medieval Muslim clergy, backed by dogmas that have nothing to do with the original revelation, waged an all-out war against reason, specifically to protect their own monopoly on interpretation.
Exactly. They protected their monopoly by sacralizing their own human opinions. They took the fallible, context-dependent words of men and demanded they be treated with the absolute reverence owed only to the eternal words of God.
Which leads to the rigidity we see.
This is why the doctrine of ijma, or scholarly consensus, is so heavily criticized by modern thinkers. What started as a way to unify a community evolved into an overbearing, intrusive instrument of control.
It micromanaged daily life.
It embedded microscopic rules that regulated a person's life from the moment they wake up to the moment they sleep. The framers of Usul al-Fiqh utilized the fear of stepping outside this consensus to refashion a religion originally based on guidance and spiritual freedom into a religion based on bureaucratic control and psychological intimidation.
But we must also acknowledge that Usul al-Fiqh was not uniformly designed as a tool of oppression.
Maybe not initially.
Right. In its origins, it was a noble attempt to establish a predictable, fair rule of law, so that a judge in Damascus and a judge in Cordoba were operating from the same principles.
But it didn't stay that way.
The fact that it expanded indefinitely, becoming an intrusive regulatory apparatus, is a hallmark of all vast bureaucratic and legal systems, both religious and secular.
So how do we fix it?
Well, the challenge moving forward, which was beautifully identified by the late Indonesian reformer Nur Khalish Majid, is not to violently destroy tradition entirely, but to desacralize it.
Desacralize it.
Yes, to recognize it as an ongoing, cumulative, and deeply human effort, rather than a fixed, unalterable divine mandate.
Which brings us to the crux of how we resolve this profound historical trauma. Based on the overwhelming evidence, it is clear to me that to cure the intellectual and political paralysis of the Ummah, a radical desacralization of tradition is not just recommended, it is mandatory.
You see it as the only viable path forward.
The only path, the doctrine of naskh, abrogation, must be entirely abandoned because the very mechanism fundamentally disrespects the perfection and eternal nature of the divine text. Reason must be fully rehabilitated, not viewed as an arrogant enemy of faith, but as the essential, God-given tool required to comprehend it.
Restoring the balance.
And above all, revelation must be restored to its preeminent position as the sole supreme arbiter. We must stop allowing human hearsay to stand in judgment over transcendent truth. Only by clearing away these unwarranted, politically motivated accretions can the original, liberating, and rational spirit of the faith be recovered.
And my conclusion, drawing from the exact same historical material, is that while the political abuses of tradition and the suppression of reason were undeniably catastrophic, tradition itself remains an inextricably linked framework.
You don't think we can separate them?
I don't. The early jurists were wrestling with the profound, perhaps impossible challenge of making the eternal perfectly applicable to the mundane dirt and mess of daily human life. The path forward is not attempting to bypass centuries of historical evolution entirely, which is an intellectual impossibility anyway.
You can't just ignore history.
Exactly. You cannot unbake the cake. Instead, the path forward is reforming and filtering that vast tradition through rigorous modern human reason. We must use reason to sift the heavy historical baggage from the brilliant universal principles, treating tradition not as an infallible dictator, but as a deeply valuable yet entirely fallible human conversation with the divine text.
The value of applying this kind of rigorous intellectual charity to the historical evolution of Islamic thought cannot be overstated. When we look deeply at the tension between a transcendent text and the messy human necessity to interpret it, we uncover profound insights into how civilizations rise, how they brilliantly adapt, and sometimes how they paralyze themselves.
It's a mirror for any legal or religious system, really.
It is. There is so much more for our listeners to explore in this material regarding that delicate, ever-shifting balance.
Indeed, there is. It forces all of us, regardless of our background, to ask a terrifying question. Whether any system of human law or interpretation can ever perfectly capture divine intent, or if the very act of trying inevitably builds a cage around the truth.
Exactly. We must always step back and ask ourselves, are we still looking up at the eternal stars, or have we simply fallen in love with the map we drew of them?